So I'm doing a demonstration on mixing plaster and applying it to your sculptures. I'm starting out with my cut styrofoam. This is the bucket that I gave you, and this has the paint liner in it. And I'm putting in about just a small amount of water to start with. So you can use cold water, you can use warm water, you can use hot water. Cold water will give you a slow cure, warm water is faster, and hot water would give you a fast cure. So depending on if you want to work slowly, I recommend starting off with the cold water until you get used to it. Got my plaster here. I got a bucket of water to wash my hands in afterwards. So I take my plaster and I slowly sift it on the water. Start off with a little bit of water when you start because you don't want to waste too much plaster. So just mix up a little bit because you might end up not using it all. So you're sifting the plaster on top of the water. And we're doing this way so that this helps prevent air bubbles in the plaster. So when we sift the plaster on top of the water, this also gives us the right proportions. So we're sifting it on until the plaster just starts to sit on the surface of the water. So it's saturating the water and then just starting to mound up on the surface of the water. So it starts to look like this, right? I got the pool of water, and then as it starts to build up, it starts to sit on the surface of the water. Next step is I take my hand and I dip my hand into the plaster and I mix it up, kind of squeezing it to mix it up. And we want to mix it up till it gets to be like so the consistency that you want is almost like kind of a loose pancake batter. You can add a little more plaster to make it a little firmer to start with. So there's a little leeway, but this is, you don't want to diverge too much from this proportions because if the proportions are too far off, then your plaster won't set correctly. So this is the kind of the consistency, kind of like a loose pancake batter. Now you need to wait, and you need to wait maybe about 10 minutes until it starts to get firm. So I'm going to pause my camera. So it's been about 5 minutes, a little bit less. So it's starting to thicken. Now, if you have a lot of detail and you want to put on a thin layer, you can use it when it's still in the very thin stage, and then you can put on a nice thin layer. So that way you don't lose your detail. Now, if you want to fill in areas, if you want it thicker, if you want to sculpt with it and make some texture with it, then you want to wait till it gets a little bit thicker. Okay. And it will start to thicken up, and when it gets to be kind of like a whipped cream consistency, that's when you can start to sculpt with it. If I try to sculpt with it now, it's just going to drip off of my sculpture. So I'm going to wait a little bit longer. So it's been another 5 minutes or so, and it's starting to set. And you can kind of see right now, it's kind of like a thick milkshake consistency. Okay, it's still going to be a little too drippy to put onto your sculpture, but you can start to put a little bit on at a time. Now it's a very short window that we have before it gets too hard to sculpt with. So like I say, make a small batch. You can even use a smaller container than this, like a yogurt sized container. You could use, see, I'm using this to prop up my computer now, but you could use one of these yogurt containers, fill it with water, and then sift your plaster into it and wait till it starts to just sit on the surface, then mix it up. So if you only need to make a small batch, I would say use a smaller container. This bucket is good if we're mixing up larger batches, which we do in the studio. So when we mix it up, as you can see, it's starting to get even thicker now. So you want to wait till it gets to be kind of like a whipped cream consistency, till it doesn't kind of drip off your hand, so that when you apply it to your sculpture, it won't just drip off your sculpture. Let's see, so I got my sculpture. Now, my suggestion is to try to carve your sculpture as close to your design as possible, so that you only need to put on a thin layer of plaster. That way, the whole plaster process is very short. It takes a lot to sculpt with the plaster. It's great for putting on textures, like those drips on the gourds, or building up ridges. But building up ridges is quite time consuming because you have to wait till it gets right to that consistency. So right now, see, it's getting to be close to a whipped cream consistency. It's still dripping off my hand. But the thing is about plaster is, once it starts to set, that window before it sets and gets too hard is very short. So we're going to wait through that process right now. So say I want to fill in these areas in between here. I can start to kind of put the plaster on. You can see right now how, if it's, depending on how I'm holding it, it doesn't drip off. So I can like fill in areas too. With the plaster. Now it's still dripping. How come it stopped? For some reason my camera keeps pausing. Okay, so now it's in that whipped cream consistency. So I can put it on my sculpture. I can kind of sculpt with it. I can fill in cracks with it. So see how I filled in this area here and it's not dripping off. I can make little bulbs with it too and let those harden. And so I could get those textures with this. You could use like a plastic bag with a hole in it and kind of push it out of the plastic bag to get your small beads here. And as you can see, it's starting to harden, so it's getting this nice kind of whipped cream consistency. This is kind of ideal to sculpt with. Next step I would do, you can wash your hand. Don't wash your hand in the sink, because you don't want to pour this water down the sink because it will clog up your drains. So have a bucket of water you can rinse off your hands with. Okay, and then you can use different tools to apply this with. Some of you, I forgot to give all of you, is a little spatula. You could use a spoon, you could use a knife, kitchen knife, whatever. This works well, so you can pick up pieces with this and you can kind of add it on here. Okay, so now it's getting thicker. So see, when I pick it up, it doesn't drip off. And this would be kind of ideal to sculpt with. So I'm putting it on, and then I use this tool to kind of round it off with. And like I say, if you have it sculpted close to how you want it, all you need to do is put a nice thin layer on your piece. And then, so see these edges here, I can fill this in. Like I say, you could use your hands, but a tool is nice because it doesn't stick to your fingers and you can kind of smooth it around your piece. So these areas here, I can kind of fill this in here. So imperfections you can fill in, and then you can kind of build it out as well. So if it needs to be rounder, you can round it out with this. But like I say, a thin layer of plaster is, and the more you can sculpt with the styrofoam, the easier it will be. This takes a while to get used to sculpting with the plaster. So you can see I'm kind of rounding this whole thing out here. Now it's starting to get hard. It's starting to get a little, right now it's at that point where it's almost too hard to sculpt with. So that window that you can actually sculpt with is very small. So like I say, mixing up small batches is much better than mixing up a big batch, because then you'll end up wasting plaster. Mixing it up in that yogurt container, small yogurt container, is the best way to start until you get used to it, and then when you're confident, you could switch to this bucket and you can mix up more. But you don't want to run out of plaster either. The plaster that I gave you, we're using it for the next project as well. So when it gets too hard, then it's going to stick to everything, and you won't be able to smooth it out. So see how it's starting to get hard to smooth out here. Still, it's a consistency I can work with, but and I could kind of sculpt with it, and it's still loose where I can kind of like carve into it. Like I say, if you want to carve into it instead of sculpting your styrofoam, I would say test out a small piece first, and you can see that it's easier to shape it with the styrofoam than to actually sculpt out your form with the plaster. So right now the plaster is almost too hard. It's getting too hard to work with. So I'm going to put this down. Okay. And if you can look in the inside here, see it's kind of too hard to work with now. So it's getting too thick, and very hard to sculpt now. So that window that you can work with it, see how it's kind of brittle right now, and it doesn't sculpt, it kind of bunches up and hard to sculpt with. Now, if you're sculpting, if you're using this liner, so this is a paint liner, or if you're using your small yogurt container, not this size, but a larger size than this, to clean up, what you do with your plaster is you let it dry in your container, and then when it dries, it gets very brittle, and then since this, you take out the liner and then you squeeze it, and you can break off the dried plaster. If you have big chunks of plaster, you probably want to clean it up. Try to put it into a ball first, and then it's hard to break off. Like if this whole thing was filled here, it would be hard to break it out once it dries. And my tools, I use like a scraper to clean off with. And you can do this when it dries too. That's your method for cleanup. And then you can wash your tool in your bucket of water. As you can see, I put some newspaper down to work with. It's pretty messy. Okay, so plaster is still not quite dry, but you can see in the inside. So you can see now it's starting to get brittle. So see, I would wait longer, but I'm doing it just for the video here. So when it gets hard, it gets brittle, and just by squeezing it, it will come off easy from the container. And then you have let your sculpture dry. When it's still in this early stage here, it's a lot easier if you want to carve into it while it's not totally dry. Okay, so I can carve into it, but you have to be quick here because once it gets dry, then the longer it sets, then the harder it gets, and the harder it will be to carve into it. But see, I can start to carve in. This lighting is not so good. See, I could start to carve these lines into it, or whatever I need for my texture. It's much easier to do this when it's still in the soft stage. So before waiting for it to dry, totally dry, it's easier to carve. All right, and that's it for now.